Pacific nights were never truly silent. The jungle breathed a restless symphony of crickets, waves, and distant thunder rolling beyond the coral reefs. But on one particular night in 1943, somewhere in the Solomon Islands, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Inside a marine perimeter, a German shepherd named Rex lifted his head. His ears twitched. His nose caught something that no human could smell: the faintest trace of sweat, metal, and gun oil carried by the wind. Sergeant John Miller, sitting half asleep beside the sandbag wall, noticed the dog's sudden stillness. He whispered, "What is it, boy?" Rex didn't respond. His body was rigid, muscles coiled like springs. His eyes, calm seconds ago, now burned with alert focus. Miller had learned to trust that look more than any radar or patrol report. Rex had been with him for 3 months, long enough for the man to understand that when the dog went silent, something was coming. Somewhere in the darkness beyond the wire, death was moving. Few people today know that thousands of dogs served during World War II. They were not symbols or mascots. They were soldiers, trained to sniff out ambushes, find wounded men, deliver messages under fire, and guard camps against unseen enemies. The Japanese called them demon dogs. To the Marines, they were war dogs, loyal, disciplined, and terrifyingly efficient when danger lurked unseen. But this story, the one that military historians rarely tell, is about a handful of these dogs who stopped one of the most daring infiltration missions ever attempted by the Imperial Japanese Army. And it began with 6 men slipping silently from a black rubber boat onto the coast of Vella La Vella Island, 6 shadows moving through palm roots and vines. Their faces painted, their hearts set on killing in silence. Their orders were simple: destroy the American supply dump, eliminate the commanding officer, leave no trace. They had done it before in the Philippines, in the Gilberts, even on Guadalcanal. Each time, they vanished before the alarm was raised. Each time, they left fear behind. But tonight, they would face an enemy unlike any they had ever met. At 14 hours, the first infiltrator reached the outer wire. He froze, scanning the dark shapes of the camp. No lights, no movement, only the rhythmic whisper of the surf. He turned to his partner, giving a nod. The two crouched low, cutting through the thin wire with silent clippers. They didn't see the 2 glinting eyes in the brush. Rex saw them first. He didn't bark. He didn't move. He simply watched, head low, nostrils flaring. Every nerve in his body burned with instinct. Miller followed the dog's gaze, but saw nothing, only black jungle. Still, he felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. He whispered to the nearby sentry, "Wake the lieutenant. I think we've got company." The sentry hesitated. "You sure?" Miller's hand tightened on his rifle. "I'm not sure, but he is." A few hundred yards away, the infiltrators crept forward again. Their tabby-soled boots left almost no sound on the damp earth. One of them, a veteran sergeant from the Japanese 6th Special Landing Force, carried a long dagger wrapped in cloth. He had slit throats in total silence before, and he intended to do it again tonight. As they moved closer to the tents, one of the men paused. He frowned. There was something strange, an odor he didn't recognize. Animal. Sharp. He opened his mouth to whisper to his comrade, and froze as a low, rolling growl sliced through the air. It wasn't loud, but it carried deep, primal, ancient, the growl of something that had seen through the darkness and decided it didn't like what it found. The sergeant's eyes widened. "Inuda, it's a dog." Inside the camp, Miller felt the vibration in the leash. Rex was trembling, not with fear, but readiness. Then came the bark. It wasn't one of those quick, nervous sounds that farm dogs made at passing strangers. It was a single, thunderous bark that seemed to shake the air. Instantly, lights snapped on. Men shouted. Boots hit the dirt. Contact. Contact, north perimeter. Machine guns rattled to life. Flashes of muzzle fire lit the trees, painting the infiltrators in bursts of red and gold. The Japanese raiders, realizing they'd been discovered, opened fire with pistols and grenades. Rex lunged forward, dragging Miller toward the commotion. A grenade landed near the command tent, exploding in a blast of dirt and smoke. One Marine went down, clutching his leg. Through the haze, Miller saw a shadow move fast, crouched low, a knife in hand. Before he could raise his rifle, Rex was already moving. The dog slammed into the infiltrator, teeth sinking into his arm. The man screamed, twisting, trying to stab, but Rex didn't let go. Miller fired once. The shadow fell still. When the smoke cleared, the camp was alive with adrenaline. Shouting, swearing, the clatter of empty magazines hitting the dirt. And somewhere out there, the rest of the Japanese team was retreating, melting back into the jungle that had once been their ally. But now, they knew it wasn't just Americans waiting in the dark. There were other hunters here. Hunters who didn't sleep. Hunters who could smell them even when they stopped breathing. That night, for the first time in the Pacific War, an infiltration team trained in silence and precision had been stopped by what they least expected, a single dog who refused to be fooled. As dawn crept over the palm trees, Miller sat beside Rex, running a hand over the dog's coarse fur. The camp was safe. The raid had failed. The price 2 Marines wounded, one dog with a bleeding paw. Miller smiled faintly and said, "Good boy, you just saved all of us." Rex only wagged his tail, as if it had been nothing at all. But for the men who survived that night, it would never be forgotten. Because after that moment, no one doubted the strange, silent power of the war dogs, the unsung guardians of the Pacific. The Pacific Theater was a world unlike any battlefield before it. Men didn't just fight the enemy. They fought nature itself. Everything was alive. The air, the ground, even the silence. At night, the jungle whispered. It had its own pulse, its own breath, and sometimes that breath was not human. In 1943, on the remote island of Vella La Vella, that silence could kill. The island was little more than a smudge of green and coral in the Solomon chain, hot, humid, and crawling with mosquitoes. To the Marines stationed there, it was the edge of the world. To the Japanese, it was a last hope to slow the Allied advance after losing Guadalcanal. The Americans had turned Vella La Vella into a small fortress, sandbagged gun pits, wooden barracks, and a crude airstrip hacked out of jungle. Every night, patrols circled the perimeter. Every dawn, new graves were dug not from combat, but from malaria, exhaustion, or infection. It was a place where even the living felt half dead. Lieutenant John Miller and his German shepherd Rex had arrived only a month earlier. The Marines called him the Professor, not because he was soft, but because he spoke little and observed everything. He had once been a police trainer in Chicago, teaching dogs to sniff out criminals in back alleys. When war came, he volunteered not just himself, but Rex too. Rex had been born on a farm near Toledo. Before the war, he'd spent his days chasing chickens and lying beside the porch. Now, his world was filled with gunfire, sweat, and orders barked in languages he didn't understand, but instincts he did. To the Marines, Rex was more than a mascot. He was part of a new experiment. A handful of dogs trained to detect infiltrators, guard ammunition dumps, and even carry messages through enemy fire. Back home, posters showed smiling children donating their pets to the Dogs for Defense program. Families believed their pets would help guard America's boys. Many never saw them again. Rex's owner, a young woman named Mary, had written a letter attached to his transfer papers. "Please take care of him. He's brave, but he's gentle. I hope he saves someone who needs him." Miller carried that note folded in his pocket and read it whenever he thought about how small the line between life and death had become. The jungle at night was the enemy's home. The Japanese had mastered stealth warfare, moving in total silence, crawling for hours through mud without breaking a twig. They painted their faces, used the wind, and carried blades instead of rifles when they hunted at night. To counter that, the Marines needed something beyond human senses. They needed the one creature that could smell fear, hear a heartbeat, and never sleep: a dog. The war dog platoons were trained at Camp Lejeune and Camp Pendleton. Their handlers learned to move like ghosts, communicating only with hand signals and whispers. Every dog had to distinguish friend from foe, scent from scent. American sweat from Japanese sweat, leather boots from tabby soles. It sounded impossible, but somehow it worked. By mid-1943, these dogs were being deployed across Pacific outposts. Bougainville, New Georgia, the Solomons, and while newspapers back home barely mentioned them. Field reports told another story. Dog unit detected Japanese patrol before contact prevented ambush. Dog refused to move forward. Enemy found waiting 50 yards ahead. Dog alerted camp at 0200 hours, enemy snipers eliminated. They became living radar. Every night, their ears and noses kept hundreds of men alive. But not every Marine trusted them. Some thought the idea was foolish, that a barking dog would only give away positions. Others whispered that it was inhumane, using an animal for man's war. Miller didn't care for those debates. He'd seen Rex in training, how he froze when he smelled danger, how his ears flicked toward sounds invisible to men. He knew one truth. This dog could sense death before it arrived. On the night after the first failed raid, the jungle was quiet again, too quiet. The Marines knew the enemy would try again. They always did. A single failure wouldn't stop an Imperial unit. It would only make them more careful. So, the Americans prepared. They doubled the guard and widened the patrol zone. Machine guns were repositioned. Trip flares reset. But Miller trusted none of it. He trusted Rex. The dog hadn't slept since the night of the attack. He prowled the perimeter like a restless shadow, sniffing, pausing, staring into the black tree line. Sometimes, Miller thought Rex could feel what the rest of them only guessed, that something was still out there, waiting. A few miles away, hidden beneath mangroves, another Japanese infiltration team received new orders. This one was smaller, only 5 men, led by Lieutenant Hideo Takuma, a veteran who had fought in Shanghai and the Philippines. Takuma's unit was known for its patience. They could lie motionless for hours, breathing through reeds underwater, or crawl half a mile without sound. They had studied the reports from the failed attempt. They believed they knew what went wrong. Dogs, Takuma said coldly. We kill the dogs first. The others nodded, grim-faced. They carried knives, grenades, and one experimental submachine gun, but no rifles. Rifles were too loud. At sunset, they began their crawl inland, guided by moonlight filtering through palms. Each step took them closer to the American camp and to Rex. Meanwhile, in the Marine compound, tension hung thick as the humidity. Men played cards under dim lamps, but spoke in whispers. Every snap of a twig, every rustle in the leaves made someone reach for a rifle. At 40 ppm, Miller lit a cigarette, then immediately crushed it out, afraid the glow might give them away. Rex sat beside him, silent, his head tilted slightly, nose twitching. Miller followed his gaze into the jungle. Nothing. Still, a feeling crept into his gut, that same gnawing unease that had saved them once before. He looked down at Rex and murmured, "If they come again, we'll be ready." The dog didn't move, only stared into the darkness, as if seeing something his human couldn't. Far beyond the wire, Takuma's men stopped. They crouched, listening. Through the dense jungle, faint and distant, came the soft rattle of a chain metal against metal. One of the infiltrators whispered, "Dogs again?" Takuma raised a hand. "We wait for the rain. When the sound is masked, we strike." Above them, thunder rolled. The night grew thick and heavy, and somewhere along the perimeter, Rex stood motionless, ears pricked, tail stiff, breathing slow. He didn't know where or when, but he knew something was coming. The jungle was holding its breath once more. The rain began just after midnight. At first, it was gentle, a whisper on the palm leaves, a soft rhythm against the tin roofs of the Marine camp. But soon, it became a curtain, thick, blinding, relentless. The men of Company D huddled under ponchos, trying to keep their rifles dry. Every drop sounded the same, until you'd been there long enough to tell the difference. Miller had learned that difference, and so had Rex. The German shepherd sat at his handler's feet, head low, fur slick with rain. He didn't blink, didn't sleep. His eyes were fixed on the tree line like a sentry carved from stone. Then, as if the night itself had shifted, Rex's ears twitched. He let out a low growl, almost inaudible under the storm. Miller stiffened. "Easy, boy," he whispered. "What do you see?" Rex didn't move, but his breathing changed. He wasn't growling at thunder. He was growling at something alive. 100 yards away, 5 Japanese infiltrators crawled through the mud. Rainwater pooled around their elbows, washing away their footprints. They moved like snakes, slow, precise, deliberate. Lieutenant Hideo Takuma led from the front, face blackened, knife between his teeth. His mission was clear: reach the American command post, plant grenades, and vanish before dawn. Quiet, he hissed in Japanese. The rain hides us. Move when I move. Behind him, Corporal Sato adjusted the sling on his weapon, a Nambu submachine gun wrapped in oiled cloth. He hated the rain. It made the trigger slippery. But tonight, it was their ally. They crawled closer 20 meters from the first line of sandbags. The only sound was the rain, until a bark split the darkness. It wasn't loud at first, just a single bark, sharp and short. But in the silence of the jungle, it was like lightning hitting the ground. Takuma froze. The others froze with him. The second bark came louder, deeper, angrier, and then came the shout. Contact. North perimeter. Spotlights burst to life. White beams cut through the sheets of rain. For a heartbeat, everything stood still light. Water, and men caught in the open. Then, chaos exploded. Machine guns roared. Bullets shredded the undergrowth. The jungle screamed with ricochets and thunder. Rex barked again. Pulling hard on the leash, Miller released him without hesitation. Go, boy. The dog sprinted into the storm, weaving between roots and puddles, nose locked on scent. He wasn't chasing sound, he was following fear. Takuma's men scattered. Sato fired his Nambu blindly toward the lights. The weapon jammed almost immediately. He cursed, slamming the bolt, mud clogging the chamber. Fall back, Takuma shouted. But before they could retreat, one of his men screamed a sound, half human, half animal. Through the sheets of rain, something hit him, a flash of movement. Jaws, muscle, and fury. Rex drove the infiltrator into the mud, clamping his arm, shaking violently. The man struggled, knife slashing, but the dog's teeth held fast. Blood mixed with rainwater, running in dark rivulets across the ground. Miller ran forward, rifle raised. Down. Rex. He fired once. The infiltrator went limp. Rex stepped back, panting, chest heaving. For a moment, everything was silent again. Just the hammering rain and the smell of gunpowder. Then, another explosion ripped through the night. A grenade detonated near the fuel drums. Flames licked the sky, orange against black. The camp turned into a scene from hell firelight reflecting on wet helmets, smoke rolling through the rain. Takuma saw his chance. He and two remaining soldiers darted toward the command post. Each carried a grenade in his hand. Fuses pulled halfway. Rex saw them too. He barked once, a warning that cut through the chaos. Miller turned. Over there. He sprinted after the dog, slipping through the mud. Tracer fire zipped overhead. Rex leapt the sandbags, closing the distance between himself and the nearest infiltrator. The man raised his grenade to throw. Rex hit him mid-motion. The grenade flew wide, exploding harmlessly in the swamp. But the second infiltrator had already reached the post. He pulled his pin and then stopped. A rifle shot rang out. The man collapsed. The grenade rolled from his hand. Fizzing, Miller dove, grabbing it, throwing it toward the trees. It exploded mid-air. The shockwave threw him backward. When he opened his eyes, the world was smoke and ringing ears. He felt a weight across his legs, heavy, warm, unmoving. Rex. For a moment, Miller thought the dog was dead. He tried to move, but his left arm refused to work. Rex. He whispered. Hey, come on. Buddy. The dog stirred weakly, eyes half open. One ear was torn. His flank burned from the blast, but he was breathing. Miller let out a shaky laugh. You crazy mutt. You saved me again. The rain began to ease. The fire hissed in the distance. Marines shouted across the camp, securing perimeters, counting survivors. By dawn, it was over. 3 Japanese dead, 2 captured, the rest gone into the jungle. The Americans had won again, but the victory felt hollow. Miller sat beside Rex, wrapping a torn bandage around the dog's leg. Every motion hurt. His shoulder was bleeding, but he didn't care. He looked at the sunrise, blood red through mist, and said softly, Guess we're both still here. Huh. Rex wagged his tail once. That was all. Hours later, Lieutenant Takuma was found dead at the shoreline, pistol in hand. His final bullet fired into the sea. On his body was a small notebook, soaked but still legible. It read, "The Americans have dogs that smell us before we see them. We cannot hide from such creatures. They fight with heart, as if they understand war." The note was translated and sent up the chain of command. By the end of 1943, Japanese infiltration tactics across the Pacific had changed. They began avoiding camps rumored to have war dogs. The beasts had become legends. That night, as the wounded were treated and the fires burned out, Miller sat in silence beside Rex's cot. A Navy corpsman stitched the dog's wounds, muttering, "Damn thing's tougher than most of us." Miller smiled weakly. "He's not a thing. He's a Marine." Outside, the jungle was quiet again, but this time, the silence felt different. Not fearful, but watchful, as if the very land had learned that sometimes courage comes on four legs. The tropical dawn rose gray and heavy, the sky bruised with fading smoke. The rain had stopped, but the air still smelled of cordite and wet earth. For the Marines of Company D, the world felt strangely quiet, the kind of quiet that only comes after surviving something that should have killed you. John Miller sat on a wooden crate outside the field infirmary, his shoulder wrapped in a blood-stained bandage. In front of him, on a cot made from spare parachute silk, lay Rex. The dog's chest rose and fell slowly, the rhythm of a survivor's breath. A corpsman knelt beside them, checking the stitches. "He'll live," he said. Miller exhaled. "You sure?" The medic nodded. "Yeah." The shrapnel missed his lung. "Damn lucky dog." Miller looked down at Rex, whispering. Luck had nothing to do with it. By mid-morning, the jungle was alive again. Birds, insects, the endless hum of unseen life. But beneath that natural rhythm lurked something else. Unfinished business. The Japanese weren't done. 2 of the infiltrators had escaped into the swamp the night before. Scouts reported footprints, blood trails, and empty ration tins near the northern ridges. It wasn't over, not yet. The Marines were ordered to sweep the area. Miller volunteered immediately. "Rex and I can track them." The commanding officer hesitated. "He's hurt." "So am I," Miller replied. "But we're both breathing." "That's enough." Minutes later, Miller and Rex were back in the jungle, moving through the dripping green underworld where sunlight barely touched the ground. Tracking in the Pacific was an art of patience. Every leaf could hide a trap. Every shadow could be a sniper's scope. Miller held his M1 Garand low, eyes flicking from the ground to the horizon. Rex walked slightly ahead, nose close to the earth, tail straight, silent. They had done this 100 times in training, but this time, it wasn't a drill. Every few steps, Rex would pause, sniff, and move again. The trail led them uphill toward a narrow ridge overlooking the coastline. There, among the ferns, Miller found it, a fresh footprint pressed deep into the mud. He raised a fist. The 2 Marines behind him froze. 2, maybe 3, Miller whispered. "They're close." Rex's ears twitched. His head turned sharply left, and then nothing. Just the wind. They crept forward another 10 yards before the world erupted. A rifle cracked. The Marine behind Miller fell backward. Blood sprang across the leaves. "Contact," someone shouted. Takuma's surviving men had set an ambush. From behind a fallen log, gunfire ripped through the brush. Miller dove for cover, pulling Rex with him. Bullets chewed bark inches above his head. "Hold your fire," he yelled. "They're trying to draw us in." Rex growled low, the same growl that had saved them before. Then he lunged, teeth bared, pulling Miller's sleeve. At first, Miller didn't understand until he saw it. A faint, almost invisible tripwire stretched across the ground, leading to a grenade trap. "Jesus," Miller muttered. He gently pushed the wire aside. "Good boy." "Rex, good boy." The gunfire slowed, then stopped. Silence again. The kind that made your skin crawl. Miller signaled to flank right, crawling through wet grass and roots. Rex stayed close, moving like a shadow. He could smell the enemy's sweat, blood, oil. He could hear them breathing. Suddenly, from behind a tree, a figure rose, knife in hand, eyes wild. Before Miller could react, Rex launched himself forward. The dog hit the man's chest, jaws clamping down on his arm. The knife fell. They rolled together into the mud, snarling and shouting. Miller fired once, then twice. The jungle went still again. He reached out, pulling Rex back by the harness. "Easy, buddy. You got him. It's over." But Rex didn't relax. He turned his head toward the ridge and began barking furiously. A grenade came flying through the trees. Miller saw it arc, spinning, bouncing once against a rock. He had no time to think. He threw himself sideways, but Rex moved faster. The dog lunged, grabbing Miller's jacket with his teeth, pulling him down behind a fallen log. The explosion tore the air apart. Dirt, leaves, and flame showered them both. When the ringing stopped, Miller could taste blood in his mouth. He looked around, dazed. The Marines were shouting, returning fire. The Japanese were retreating, vanishing into the smoke. And then he saw Rex. The dog lay still beside him, chest rising shallowly. One of his hind legs was twisted, his fur burned, his side peppered with shrapnel. Miller crawled to him, hands shaking. "No, no, no, not like this." Rex opened his eyes. For a moment, he looked straight at his handler, calm, steady, loyal. Then his head dropped against Miller's hand. "Stay with me," Miller whispered. "That's an order, soldier." The firefight ended minutes later. When the smoke cleared, 2 enemy bodies were found near the ridge and 1 trail of blood leading down to the sea. The infiltrators were gone, but the cost had been paid. Miller carried Rex back to camp in his arms, ignoring the pain in his shoulder. No one said a word as he passed. Even the jungle seemed to go quiet. At the infirmary, the corpsman tried to take the dog from him. Miller shook his head. "I've got him." He set Rex down gently, whispering, "You did it, buddy. You saved me again. You saved all of us." Rex blinked once slow, tired, and let out a long, soft breath. Then he was gone. The camp buried him that evening, under a palm tree at the edge of the airstrip. The men gathered silently, caps in hand. No speeches, no ceremony, just a single wooden marker carved with a combat knife. Rex. He didn't just serve, he saved. Miller stood for a long time after everyone else left. The sea breeze carried the smell of salt and smoke. He thought of Mary's letter, the one Rex had brought from Ohio. He unfolded it from his pocket, reading the last line again. "I hope he saves someone who needs him." He smiled through tears. He did. Mary. He did. That night, the Japanese never returned. The jungle remained silent, as if mourning one of its own. For weeks after, patrols reported no further infiltrations. Word spread among both sides. The Americans now had guardians no soldier could sneak past. Dogs who could sense death before it arrived. To the Marines, Rex wasn't just a hero. He was proof that courage didn't belong only to men with rifles or medals. Sometimes it came with fur, fangs, and an unbreakable heart. The morning after Rex's burial, the Marines of Vella La Vella woke to an unfamiliar sound silence. No alarms, no shots fired in the night, only the ocean whispering against the reef, and the steady rhythm of waves touching the shore. For the first time in months, the men felt safe. But for Sergeant John Miller, that silence wasn't peace. It was absence. Every morning, Rex had been there pacing beside him, tail flicking, nose sniffing the wind for things men couldn't see. Now, the space beside his cot was empty, and that emptiness felt heavier than the rifle on his shoulder. 2 days later, the battalion chaplain approached him. "I heard about your dog," he said gently. Miller nodded, saying nothing. The chaplain continued. "Command wants to recognize him. The War Dog Corps is sending a commendation. They're calling it Extraordinary Devotion Under Fire." "Hutton?" Miller stared at the ground. "Rex doesn't need a medal," he said quietly. "He just needed to live." Still, when the paper came stamped, sealed, Official Miller folded it carefully and placed it beside Mary's letter in his pack. He didn't know why, but it felt right. Over the following weeks, reports spread across the Pacific. An infiltration unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, trained for silent killing, had been stopped by a Marine dog patrol. The story circulated through bases, mess halls, and newspapers back home. One headline read, "Devil Dogs versus Demon Men. How a German Shepherd Saved a Pacific Outpost." But behind the words was something deeper, something the public never truly saw, because Rex wasn't alone. Across the Pacific, hundreds of other dogs were already at war. In Bougainville, a Doberman named Kurt had detected a hidden machine gun nest moments before an ambush. He barked once enough to alert his handler. Seconds later, a Japanese bullet struck him through the chest. Kurt became the first Marine dog to die in action. In Guam, a collie mix named Skipper carried wounded messages through burning jungle under artillery fire, returning again and again until his paws bled. And in Saipan, a black Labrador called Chips dragged his handler from a collapsing foxhole after a mortar strike. He later charged a pillbox, forcing its surrender, a feat so remarkable that Eisenhower himself mentioned him in dispatches. By the end of 1944, the War Dog program had grown from a handful of volunteers to over 10. Those were canines across every theater of war. They guarded airfields, sniffed out mines, carried communications lines, and tracked down snipers hidden in caves. Each was paired with one handler, a bond as close as blood. The Marines called them two-man units, because neither functioned without the other. Rex and Miller had been one of those units. Their story became training material at Camp Lejeune, where new handlers listened in silence as instructors told the tale of the dog who saved a platoon. They studied the lesson: trust your dog when he growls. Listen when he stops. So should you. The Japanese, too, took notice. Captured officers later admitted in interrogations that infiltration tactics had to change. They could outwit men but not noses. They began calling the American dogs Kishin no Inu, spirit dogs. In their diaries, some soldiers wrote of hearing barking in the jungle at night and freezing in fear. One note, found near New Georgia, read, "We no longer fear the rifle. We fear the dog who finds us before dawn." Back in the United States, the story of the war dogs began to spread through radio and film reels. Newsreels showed handlers training their dogs to jump from landing craft, crawl under barbed wire, and detect explosives buried deep in sand. Children sent letters addressed simply to the dog who saved our soldiers. Mothers mailed blankets, collars, even biscuits. They didn't know that most of the dogs would never come home. For many, the war ended far from where it began. They were buried on foreign soil under palm trees, on beaches, beside runways. Their graves marked only with wooden signs and the names of men who remembered them. In the months that followed, Miller's unit moved from Vella La Vella to Bougainville, and finally to Guam. Everywhere they went, he noticed the same thing: more dogs, different breeds, different handlers, but the same purpose. He'd watch them working the line, sniffing through the rain, and he'd feel something tighten in his chest. One night, he sat by the shoreline, writing a letter home. He didn't have the heart to send it to Mary, the woman who'd given up Rexu. Instead, he wrote to his sister, "We lost good men out here, but the bravest didn't wear boots. He saved my life twice. If people back home ever ask whether dogs understand war, tell them yes. They understand everything that matters." In late 1945, after Japan's surrender, the surviving war dogs were gathered for demobilization. Thousands were shipped home, retrained for civilian life, but not all could adapt. Some were too scarred, too conditioned to the sounds of battle. Miller was offered a discharge and a chance to return to Ohio. He accepted, but before he left, he visited the War Dog Cemetery near Guam. Row after row of white markers stretched under palm trees. Each bore a name: Duke, Bullet, Lucky, King, Rex. Some had simple notes carved by hand. He did his duty, faithful to the end. Miller stood before one marker and saluted. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The sun sank behind the Pacific, staining the waves gold. Somewhere beyond that horizon lay home and peace. But in Miller's mind, the sound of rain, gunfire, and barking would never fade. He had seen courage in every form, in men, in battle, and in the eyes of a dog who never hesitated. War had taken much from him, but it had also given him something unbreakable: the knowledge that loyalty could be as powerful as any weapon. And as the wind rustled the palms above the quiet graves, it carried one unspoken truth across the ocean. They didn't just guard men, they guarded humanity itself. Years passed, The guns fell silent. The banners came down, and the world began to rebuild. Factories turned from tanks to tractors, bullets to bread. The soldiers who survived returned home carrying medals, scars, and memories they never spoke of aloud. But among the ships that brought men back from war, few noticed the other passengers, dogs in steel crates, tagged with serial numbers, each one marked U.S.S. War Dog. For many, it was the first time they had seen sunlight that wasn't filtered through jungle leaves. They wagged their tails, sniffed the air, and waited for the handlers who had once stood beside them in the dark. Some were reunited with their trainers, some were adopted by new families, and some simply couldn't adjust. Handlers described how their dogs would wake at night, trembling at the sound of thunder, staring toward invisible enemies. One Marine wrote, "He still watches the door every night. I think he's waiting for orders." They had fought in a war no one truly prepared them for. And yet, without them, thousands of men might never have come home. In 1946, the War Dog Training Center at Camp Lejeune held a quiet ceremony. Dozens of handlers stood shoulder to shoulder as their surviving dogs were released from service. One officer read aloud, "They have served with courage and devotion, under fire and in fear, without question and without hesitation. Their loyalty has been absolute. Their sacrifice, beyond measure." Then the gates opened. Some dogs sprinted back to their owner's arms. Others stood still, confused, as if unsure whether they were truly free. Sergeant John Miller was there. He'd come to pay his respects, not just for Rex, but for all of them, in his hand. He carried a small wooden tag, Rex's identification number, stamped and faded. When the ceremony ended, he approached the memorial wall. He pressed the tag against the cold metal and whispered, "You did your duty, old boy, and I'll never forget." After the war, Miller returned to Ohio. He married, had 2 children, worked as a police trainer again, but the jungle never truly left him. On rainy nights, he would step outside and listen, and sometimes he swore he could still hear the distant bark echoing through the storm. He kept Mary's letter, the War Dog commendation, and Rex's tag in a small box by his bed. He never showed it to anyone until years later, when his son asked, "Dad, what was the bravest thing you ever saw?" Miller smiled faintly. "It had 4 legs," he said. Decades passed. Historians wrote about generals and admirals, battles and strategies, but not about the dogs. For a long time, their names were forgotten, buried in the footnotes of history, until one day, a group of veterans petitioned Congress to build a memorial. They argued that these animals had saved thousands of lives, deserved the same recognition as the men they'd fought beside. In 2013, their wish finally came true. At Joint Base San Antonio, the U.S.S. Military Working Dog Team's National Monument was unveiled. Bronze statues of handlers and their dogs standing side by side, eyes fixed on eternity. At the base of the monument were words that could have been written for Rex, for Kurt, for all of them, faithful companions, forever remembered. Tourists visit it now, snapping photos, reading plaques, some even placing dog tags or small flags at the statue's feet. Children ask, "Did these dogs really go to war?" And their parents answer softly, "Yes," and many never came back. Sometimes, old men come too, bent-backed Marines with fading tattoos, whispering stories only the wind can hear. They salute, not out of duty, but gratitude, because they know the truth that history nearly forgot. The courage doesn't need a rifle, and heroism isn't always human. The story of Rex and the war dogs lives on, not in textbooks, but in the quiet respect of those who understand what loyalty means. In every K-9 unit that patrols today's streets, in every search dog that saves a life after disaster, in every handler who whispers "good boy" before heading into danger, the spirit of those wartime companions endures. They taught soldiers to trust their instincts again. They reminded humanity, in its darkest hour, that faith and love could still exist amid chaos. They were not machines. They were not tools. They were hearts wrapped in fur, brave enough to walk beside men into hell and bring them back home. If you stand near the old training grounds at Camp Lejeune today, you might still hear it, the faint echo of boots and paws on damp earth, the whisper of a voice saying, "Stay close, boy," and the quiet answer of a tail thumping against the ground. The ghosts of the war dogs are still there, waiting, guarding, watching, not for orders but for remembrance, because they were never just soldiers. They were guardians of the bond between man and animal, a bond strong enough to outlast even war itself, and that is their legacy. They didn't fight for medals. They didn't know flags or nations. They fought for the men who loved them, and in doing so, they reminded the world what loyalty truly means. If this story moved you, if you believe these forgotten heroes deserve their place in history, then share their story. Hit like, subscribe, and ring the bell so you won't miss the next untold tale of courage and sacrifice from the Second World War. And tell us below, would you trust a war dog by your side in the dark? Because somewhere out there, beneath the rustling palms and the fading echoes of gunfire, a single truth remains. They didn't just serve, they saved.